Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better. Mastering Stress 6. Welcome back. This is the final video in the sequence. In the last video, we considered the idea that time consciousness is the greatest stressor. In this video, I invite you to consider the way to undermining that greatest of all stressors. As you may already suspect, living well requires an absence of time consciousness. The wise realized that millennia ago. In case you are stuck on my just having used the phrase, the way, let me quickly reassure you that there are actually many ways of realizing the way. They all, though, have the same result, namely eliminating time consciousness. Notice that, of course, time consciousness is consciousness, awareness. When we live well, we are unaware of time. We lack any thought of it. We experience no thought of it. In the last video, I used the term no thought, which is a term that may be unfamiliar to you. Permit me 2 points about it. First, obviously, when we experience no thought, there is no thought of time, no time consciousness. Second, do not confuse no thought with no consciousness, a total lack of awareness. At least occasionally, most of us spontaneously experience alert consciousness without thought, such as, perhaps, for a few seconds in the morning after waking up before the usual avalanche of heavy thoughts descends, during sexual ecstasy, in moments of peak performance or other moments of optimal experience. In other words, I'm here using the word thought to refer to judgments or conceptualizations. For example, to think that shirt is red or that woman is beautiful is to make a judgment, to conceptualize, to have a thought. Please wonder, how does time consciousness create stress? More generally, how does thinking create stress? Lest you accuse me of failing to define my terms, a concept is just a principle of classification. So to conceptualize is to classify. When I classify that shirt as being an instance of redness or that woman as being an instance of beauty, I have conceptualized them. Therefore, to think is to conceptualize, judge, sort, classify, divide, discriminate, separate, and so on. Thinking requires separating. There can be no thought without separation. Why does this matter? Here's the key insight. It matters because, again, separation is always the cause of dissatisfaction, unsatisfactoriness, sorrow, misery, suffering, anguish, distress, affliction, frustration, misery, anxiety, unease, unhappiness, or what those in the Buddhist tradition call dukkha. Buddhism begins with the recognition of the problem and importance of dukkha. Since living well requires diminishing it, the pervasive presence of dissatisfaction in our lives presents an important problem for everyone seriously interested in living well. Since we're on the topic of thinking, permit me to point out another significant idea, namely that no thought can express the whole truth. All are partial. No thought can be the whole truth. So what? If you would be wise, never attach yourself fanatically to any particular thought. Wouldn't the world be a much kinder place if everyone learned how to detach from thoughts in order to examine them, how to keep them in perspective? The problem is that we all have a tendency to attach to our favorite thoughts. We identify with them, just as we identify with our bodies or features of our bodies. Yet all these are just transient forms, objects that we single out for our attention. By identifying with certain forms and by not identifying with others, we create separation. Whenever we create separation, we create dissatisfaction. Therefore, by making these identifications, we are unintentionally making our lives worse. Another way to say this is to say that unity and love heal, whereas disunity and hatred injure. Compare my book, Love and Respect. To identify with something is to make it a part of our lives, to embrace it as part of us. As infants, we naturally identify with our bodies, and with our parents or caregivers, and then with our siblings and other family members. Later, we typically identify with our playmates. we find it natural as we grow to identify with others like us, such as those who attend the same school, those who live in the same neighborhood or city, those who play on the same team, those who live in the same country, those who share the same religion, those who do the same kind of work, and so on. Many also go on to identify with certain other kinds of animals, such as the pets we have or the horses we ride. Some later identify with all sentient beings. Others even identify with non-sentient beings, including our planet. In short, our self-concepts are not fixed. They are malleable. All these identifications are thoughts, judgments, conceptualizations. Specifically, they are identity judgments, which assert that two apparently different things are really one thing. This is how we use thoughts to create our self-concepts. This is how we come to identify with certain favorite thoughts. Why do we do it? Why do we identify with thoughts so routinely, habitually, addictively? A critical reason is that thinking is very useful. We use it to solve problems. We couldn't survive without it. In fact, it's so useful that we overuse it. In other words, we rely too heavily on thoughts. Here's an important question to ask yourself. Who am I? In other words, what exactly do I identify with? Please do not consider time in your answer. Usually, your concept of yourself is an autobiography, a story with a past, a present, and likely a future, right? Who, though, are you right now? Who are you apart from your past and, if any, your future? You are much, much more than your autobiography, your story. You can know that immediately because you are real in the present moment, even without your story. Many sages have invited us to do this, and when we do, we may notice the connection between how we understand our lives and how we understand our deaths. Consider this from Sogyal Rinpoche. Quote, "Perhaps the deepest reason why we are afraid of death is because we do not know who we are. We believe in a personal, unique, and separate identity. But if we dare to examine it, we find that this identity depends entirely on an endless collection of things to prop it up. Without our familiar props, we are faced with just ourselves, a person we do not know, an unnerving stranger with whom we have been living all the time, but we never really wanted to meet. Isn't that why we have tried to fill every moment of time with noise and activity, however boring or trivial, to ensure that we are never left in silence with this stranger on our own?" End quote. Let's consider this idea of silence. Perhaps you've encountered the idea that silence is the language of the divine. Silence is the absence of noise. What's the source of the most noise? Thoughts. If we fail to let ourselves experience the profound silence of no thought, we never realize our own nature. We are familiar with our thoughts because they're a huge part of our noisy selves. But without silence, we never realize our essence, our real identity, what we really are. Yes, there's a sense in which it's true that you are your story. However, there's much more to you than just that. Please don't sell yourself short. You don't just exist temporally, in becoming. You also exist in being, which is beyond time. Your nature has two sides. You are a human being. Of the two, your temporal or time-bound side is actually of lesser importance. The essential you, what you are, is eternal, timeless. If so, if you stay stuck in time, bound by becoming, imprisoned in the conditioned, you never realize your own nature and being, in the unbound and unconditioned. This is why limiting yourself to identifying with all your physical or mental forms condemns you to perpetual flux. What's wrong with that? Since all forms are impermanent, it's simple. How could there be lasting satisfaction or fulfillment in the domain in which nothing is lasting? That's impossible. Is this difficult to understand? Yes. That's because it's impossible to think being. There are no forms in being that can be objects of consciousness. It's ineffable. Does it follow that being is unreal? No. If, though, it is real, how can anyone apprehend it? It's simple. Drop all thoughts and experience being directly. The key is no thought. Since no thought is about being, and since there is nothing, no thing, no object, no form, nothing that can be singled out for our attention in being. There is nothing except the opposite of becoming in being. Since, like all thoughts and concepts, all words and languages are forms in becoming, it makes sense that it's impossible to talk or think one's way to an apprehension of formless being. The best they can be are signposts pointing elsewhere. Excuse me. Sages use language to point elsewhere in two ways. The first is the negative way. For example, since becoming is temporal, being is non-temporal, eternal. For example, since there's a lot of death and stress in becoming, being is deathless and stressless. The second way is the way of contradiction. For example, being may be referred to as the fecund void or the fruitful emptiness. However, although being is beyond conceptualization, it can be experienced directly. In fact, your nature is being. You already essentially are it. If so, there's nothing for you to achieve or gain to live well. All that you need to do is to drop all thoughts that obstruct experiencing yourself. Doing that, just for a moment, will provide you with a direct glimpse of being, enable you to see into your timeless self. Doing this is critical to being able to live well. One way to understand this is to relate it to the purpose or meaning of your life. Compare my, are you living without purpose? Since you are both becoming and being, if you look for your central purpose only in becoming, you won't find it. There can be no lasting fulfillment in the domain of ceaseless flux. That makes sense, right? This is really good news for anyone whose self-understanding has so far been radically incomplete. There's nothing wrong with you. Your life isn't meaningless. Like many others, you've simply been trying to do the impossible, namely, create for yourself a life of unconditioned value in the domain that is pure conditioning. In fact, you don't have to create a meaningful life because since your essence is being, you already are infinitely valuable. Adjusting to that insight may take a while. How can you be sure? If you begin by paying attention to your own thoughts as they arise and fall away, you'll notice that about 80% of them are utterly useless. In fact, they are obstructive and make our lives worse by generating separation and, so, dissatisfaction. By the time we realize this, we've become thought addicted. We become so used to thinking all the time that most people still think that incessant thinking is normal. They identify with their favorite thoughts. Well, sadly, although that has become normal, it's certainly not good for us. Once we identify the source of so much of our dissatisfaction, what can we do about it? It's simple. Stop thinking so much. Think when it's necessary or useful to solve some problem, but otherwise break the habit of incessantly thinking, judging, classifying. This is the only best way to master stress. If you are serious about leading a life with much less stress, master the art or skill of no thought. Break the terrible habit of being enslaved by compulsive thinking. Why is it such a terrible habit? Excessive thinking spoils life. For example, isn't thought addiction the root of all other addictions? Even when they know it's dangerous, why do people get drunk or stoned or engage in extreme sports? Aren't they desperately trying to alleviate the incessant weight of heavy thoughts? Substituting one addiction for another isn't living well. Living well is living freely, living without thought addiction or any other kind of addiction. Is a life of freedom possible for you? Yes. Again, it's even simple. However, don't confuse simple with easy. Do smokers find it easy to break the habit of smoking? Do alcoholics find it easy to break the habit of drinking? Do those addicted to opiates find it easy to break their habit? I'm able to assure you from personal experience that it's not easy to break the habit of compulsive thinking. Being naturally lazy myself, I've researched the easiest way to do it. There are lots of options, lots of meditative or spiritual practices. Please don't confuse the meaning of spiritual with the meaning of religious. There's only one belief required to begin to use a meditative or spiritual practice, namely, that it might help. Compare, unless you thought knowing how to swim or skate would be beneficial to you, why learn? That's good news. If you really give some classic practice a shot and it doesn't work for you, try another until you find one that enables you to break your compulsive thought addiction and to enjoy no thought. There are multiple paths that lead to the same destination. You may already have such a practice. If so, why not commit to it without reservation? You're already familiar with it, and so don't have to learn something new. Will it reduce stress? Certainly. There's no question about that. Every classic practice will. You can rely on that fact in advance because you already understand that it wouldn't have survived otherwise. As long as you restrict yourself to testing one classic practice at a time, you'll be fine. To sum up, the right way to master stress is the right way to live life. What is living well? It's an interpenetration of becoming and being, which is a kind of balance or harmony. That makes at least initial sense because being out of balance is stressful. The problem comes that we are often so consumed by events and experiences and becoming that we neglect being. We fail to open to being, which means that we fail to understand ourselves well. How can we possibly live well without understanding ourselves properly? The way to master stress is to live well, which means opening to being. Opening to being is now, in this present moment. There is no other moment, is there? Master some classic practice and see for yourself what happens. I know that you'll be glad that you did. I hope that you found these videos helpful. Thanks for your attention. I wish you all the best.